All right, good morning, guys. Welcome back again. Thanks so much for your attendance and for your attention to the class. Just have about 2 minutes until we start, and then we'll get rolling. Hey, Zachary, how's it going? Good to see you. See if any of the students come. So far, it's just me, so I'll just wait. Hi, Kylie. Sebastian, hey there. Zoe, hello. Chase, what's up? Simon, Annabella, good to see you guys. Okay, so it's 10 a.m. I'm going to let things get started now. Welcome back, as usual, and I hope you had a good weekend. I don't know if some of you guys may watch the Oscars or anything. Interesting awards ceremony. I mean, it's always fun to see those. I was a little disappointed, I got to say, with Best Actor, but I guess Anthony Hopkins is a great actor, but I thought maybe Chadwick Boseman would get it. Either way, though, guys, yeah, I didn't see a lot of the nominated films this year. I saw Promising Woman the other day, though. That was pretty good. But anyway, back to philosophy. Well, actually, one more little side topic. Can you believe this? This weekend, someone broke in my car. So, hey, how's it going, Lane? Yeah, just like yesterday, last night. So, what a hassle. Hey. But, yeah, they smashed out the back window, and then they stole, like, a nice guitar that was inside in a hard shell case. So I had to deal with that, but it's actually not too bad. I have, yeah, from my car, someone stole some stuff and broke into it.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah. It's okay, though. I have insurance, and I have, like, home insurance and stuff, so it's actually going to just pay for they already told me they're sending a check for the guitar in the next couple days, so that's not too bad. But it always reminds you to be mindful of when you're leaving things. If I probably hadn't left the hard shell case in the back seat, then it might not have aroused interest, because that was the only thing that they did. They just broke in and took the guitar. So anyway, it was parked in the underground parking garage of my apartment complex building. So I think someone must have waited until the mechanical gate opened. And they said, I talked to the building staff, and they say this kind of thing has happened in the past. It's not unprecedented, but anyways, yeah, just another one of those little things that happens in life that you got to deal with. But I'm not too stressed about it. It's all good. Just thought I would share that with you guys as we're starting the meeting. But anyway, it's good to be with you. So let me just kind of take us back into our material really quick, right? So we're talking about philosophy of mind, and we reviewed the work of Descartes, his argument for dualism, which is mainly based on conceivability and the existence of God, and the thought that you can imagine the mind and body being separate. Then last time there was this discussion of the work of Daniel Stoljar. So a couple words about him. He starts by just defining physicalism as the position that everything's physical, including things that don't immediately seem as though they were just based on physics. But if a person's studying history, poetry, music, or anything else, these are really just indirectly branches of physics as well, because according to physicalism, everything, even me and you and our thoughts that we're having, are just the playing out of atoms in space according to the physical laws of nature. So everything's more or less physics. He says there's two questions that have to be grappled with to fully embrace or understand physicalism, and one of them is the interpretation question, which asks, what does it mean to say that everything's physical? And a separate question is the truth question, which asks, is it true that everything is physical? On the interpretation question, he says to answer that, what it means to say that it's all physical, we have to consider the idea of supervenience. Okay, so supervenience is a concept that's best illustrated through the example of a dot matrix picture, or any kind of image, really, which is the product of a bunch of little parts assembled in a given pattern. So with a dot matrix image, you have a big picture, but what it's formed out of at the base level are a bunch of little dots of colored ink in a given pattern. Or if you like, a more modern example could be the case of a digital monitor, computer, cell phone, or television screen, which displays an image, but does so because of the pattern of pixels that are illuminated against the resolution of the device. So whether you're mapping an image out by assigning pixels to the different points on the screen, or whether you're mapping an image out by assigning dots of ink to the different points on a dot matrix grid, the idea, I hope, is clear that you can have a big structure or big picture formed out of a bunch of little bits, whether they be ink dots or pixels. Okay, so if you have two matrices with the same exact order and pattern of parts, then they would have to have the same global features. The terminology global feature just refers to any macroscopic, large-scale aspect of the composite. So if there's a picture with like the president signing a bill and there's an American flag in the frame, then you could say that the American flag is one of the global features of that image, for example. And anyway, the thought is that all the global features are determined completely by the configuration of little bits that form it. So if you had two identical matrices with the same parts in the same order, they would have to have the same global features too. And likewise, if there were two images with different global features, then because these global features are nothing other than the constituent dots, they would have to also differ in the order and distribution of dots. So different global features, different dots. Same dots, same global features. Now, compare that whole explanation with the physical universe. And think of it like this. This universe is a big structure, which is also, in a way, formed out of tiny little elements, which are not pixels nor dots of ink, but rather atoms. And according to physicalism, just as with these dot matrices, the whole universe and all the big picture things within it are nothing other than the creation out of these little atoms, the configuration and combination of the atoms put together in whatever order. So if there were two universes, right, follow me. If there were two universes with the same atomic facts, then they would have to have the same global features as well, right down to all the elements of your psychology and your consciousness. So this claims then that your consciousness itself is just caught up in the matrix of physical forces, such that if there were a physical duplicate of the universe, your consciousness would be duplicated too. So your consciousness is not something other than the physical, because it's governed and constituted by atoms. Okay, now, and what's a global feature of reality? Like a global feature of reality is like the equivalent of like something pictured in an image, but a whole object. So like me, you, this classroom, this computer or device you're watching it on. These are objects that are formed out of the little atoms, and those would be the so-called global features, just to list a few of our universe. Now, after that, there were a couple arguments that he gave to try and convince that physicalism is true, and he had two of them. One was the argument from causal closure, and one was the argument from methodological naturalism. So just briefly, I'll summarize those. The causal closure argument says, first of all, that everything that has a cause has a physical cause. Second, it says that the mind, thought, can cause behavior. Like, so if I say, watch, I'm going to clap my hands, and then I do, it's because I think, and then I direct my body to do it. So thought, of course, can be the cause behind doing stuff physically. So according to those two premises, everything that has a cause has a physical one, and your mind can cause your actions. So your mind causing these actions has to be a physical cause, namely the brain. The third premise then just claims that when you have a cause for something, it's the only cause. So there can't be two or more than one. Since the brain is known to be a cause of your behavior, the third premise tries to exclude from consideration other available causes like a soul or a spirit or a mind that's not physical. So if the brain causes your behavior, the third premise is just saying that's the only cause. Therefore, the combination of three premises implies that mental events just are physical events. Your mind, which chooses to do things, is just a brain physically doing things. And there's no such thing as a non-physical mind. Okay, which brings us then to, well, there's one other argument, the methodological naturalism argument. That says it's reasonable to believe what science does. Science and the practice of science assumes physicalism is true, so therefore it's reasonable for you to believe it as well. Okay, now that's our review of the last meeting. I always like to bring us back online from a weekend away to get us into the topic again. But now we're going to continue with a new author. Hey, Ben, good to see you. The new author on the same material is J.J.C. Smart, and that's what we'll focus on today for the remainder of the time. So here he is, J.J.C. Smart. And he's, well, recently deceased, kind of, 1920 to 2012. And this is a paper of his from 1959, which is called Sensations and Brain Processes. Okay, so that's the author, his lifespan, the date of the publication of this article we're reading. He's a Scottish-born philosopher, and he's got an interesting body of work. He's done some work in ethics, but also, as you see here, philosophy of science. And there's actually, in a way, it's like a small world in philosophy. So I'm a few degrees removed from him in terms of an association. I did a book like in 2014 with another philosopher who's a few generations older than me, but she's like Chandana Chakrabarty. She's a scholar of Indian philosophy. She's like up in her 70s now. But anyway, when she was very young and getting her PhD, one of her dissertation advisors was J.J.C. Smart. So I don't know, I guess then there's a little bit of a conduit running through me to you from him. But let's go ahead and talk about his ideas then. So this paper, you see the title, Sensations and Brain Processes. First thing you need to know is that he's arguing that sensations just are brain processes. So let me write that statement down and also try and define for you what he means with the word sensations. Okay, so here is his position and thesis he's defending. It's actually sort of straightforward. He defends this position. Sensations equal brain processes. This is his claim that he's out to try and prove, or at least defend. Sensations equals brain processes. It's an identity statement, like almost a math equation where 2 + 2 = 4. What is a sensation? Okay, in his usage, here's what it means or refers to. Sensations are just any state of consciousness whatsoever, any state of consciousness. And I'll explain a little more. Okay, so sensations is just a generic label that he's giving to any and all states of consciousness, whatever they may be, from the most random to the most specific. So the state of consciousness of riding a bike, listening to music, playing a musical instrument, pleasure, pain, fear, anxiety, hope, panic, the sensation, the conscious state of watching a philosophy lecture and taking notes, or the sensation of being a philosophy professor delivering a lecture in a class, the sensation of running. Could I go on eating ice cream and it tastes good, or pizza, whatever it is. Any conscious state you could possibly experience, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, boring, or something in between. That's what the word sensations is being used to refer to here. So it's quite broad in scope. You're having sensations right now even because you are conscious and you're experiencing stuff. So sensations, he is claiming, are just brain processes. That's what they are. That's what he's arguing. Now, what that means is that, like, say when you're having a fun experience watching a film, and that's the state of consciousness you're going through, what it is just a brain process. So he says all of our sensations are nothing other than the brain being in a particular physical state at that given time. The neurons and synapses, etc., dopamine receptor sites and things in your brain, having that particular configuration physically, that's just what it is to taste the ice cream or to feel the little small amount of pain from getting a vaccination shot, or that's what it is to think and remember something. If I ask you right now to have a memory of your mother or something, the sensation of having the memory is just the brain being in a particular physical state at that time. So he's claiming sensations are brain processes. If they are, then physicalism is true. because the only thing that anybody thinks is not physical is the life of the consciousness of the mind. So if sensations are themselves just physical states of the brain, then it's all physical and physicalism is true. So he is a physicalist. He's trying to defend the position in favor of saying there's nothing that's not physical and consciousness is physical too, because consciousness and sensations are just brain states, which are physical things. Now, part of the reason that he wants to make this case that sensations are identical to brain processes is because he thinks the situation would be quite odd if sensations and consciousness were the one and only thing that physical science could not explain. Okay, because as we see increasingly with the passage of time and modernism, we're getting to explain more and more of reality and the universe based on the physical and chemical constituents of reality and physical laws. So he thinks, wouldn't it be strange and perhaps not elegant if everything in the universe was susceptible to physical and scientific explanation? Oh, but not human consciousness. Just leave that out. Leave that out to the side. It's something mysterious. Scientists can't deal with that. He says, no, the scientists would rather be able to explain everything about reality, not just some parts of it. So there's a word he introduces here at this point. This is a word that refers to something that is not explained by science or that remains unexplained. And the term is Gnomological Dangler. So let me write that here and just discuss it a bit. You know the title, the author, the dates, so that I'm erasing. A little terminology from the author. Gnomological Dangler. Okay, so what this means or refers to again is something that remains unexplained by physical sciences or by science just generally. Okay. Gnomological Dangler. The word gnomological derives from Greek. Nomos is of or pertaining to law. So gnomological dangler, you should think of as something that is like outside of the body of collected scientific knowledge and understanding. So I don't know if a visual metaphor helps you, but think of everything that we could understand in science as like a self-contained sphere of knowledge. And a gnomological dangler would be some random thing that's not inside of that sphere, that's floating out there, and we have not yet been able to bring it into our scientific comprehension. So these would be like mysterious, unexplained things that science, at least as of yet, has not found an adequate way to explain or analyze. Now, question though, let's see if you have an intuition here. From the point of view of a scientist or physicist, do you think that gnomological danglers are good? Do they like for there to be such gnomological danglers? Or do you think they would prefer it if they could have an explanation scientifically for these things? So what do you think? Is the scientist a fan of the gnomological danglers, yay or nay? They're not, correct. And so if you have that intuition, you're right. No, the scientist doesn't like that because what it means is it's like a failure of science to explain something, isn't it? It would mean that there's some stuff that science cannot grasp, that it cannot provide a thoroughgoing and total explanation for. So it would represent a failure of the scientific field to give an explanation, and science has the ambition anyway to explain everything about reality according to physical principles, not just some of it. So science doesn't want to just say, look at the volcano going off or the electrical discharge of lightning or, you know, the orbit of the planets or photosynthesis and just stop there. Don't deal with human consciousness, but let's talk about everything else and analyze and explain it. So clearly he thinks that science rejects the concept of gnomological danglers. Now, what about consciousness, though? Consciousness and sensations, as he labels them, would be a gnomological dangler if they were not the same thing as brain processes, right? If the dualist is correct anyway, and the mind is something that has nothing necessarily to do with physical reality, and it's something that doesn't even have any extension in space, if consciousness is produced in that way, then it would be a gnomological dangler. So he's out to show us that dualism is not true or that there are no very good compelling arguments that would require us to be a dualist. Having dismissed what he thinks would be the best dualist rejections of this claim, he thinks then will lead with the conclusion that physicalism is correct and sensations just are brain processes. So here's the state of play. The author's a physicalist. He says sensations are none other than brain processes. So as interesting and subjective and personal as those sensations may seem to us, they're really just physical states of the brain at a given time, and therefore there's nothing about them that's not physical, so they're not nomological danglers, contrary to what the dualist says. Now, from here, his goal is to try and take on the best dualist objections to this statement. So the way that the remaining part of the argument will go is he's going to raise objections from dualists and try to rebut them. Okay, so, sort of like how a lawyer might do. Here's what my opposing attorney will argue, and I'm going to try and give a pre-buttal of those points, right? Like try to rebut those points in my own right. So I'm going to take you on a tour through the different objections that he states in response to this and how he tries to defend against those objections. So just don't lose track of the bigger picture. He is a physicalist. He thinks that sensations are brain processes. Now he's going to try and stimulate a imagined argument with those that think that sensations are not brain processes, and he's going to try and defeat their objections. Okay, so now I have to report on the objections to his own claim that sensations are brain processes. Okay, so he lists 8 different, I think, objections to this, but I don't want to go through all 8 because I thought some were more important than others, and I thought some were also a bit repetitive. So I'm just going to kind of zoom in on the ones that I thought were the most critical for your understanding of his paper. So let's do that. Clearing the board just a bit. So why does J.J.C. Smart think that sensations are brain processes, or why does he say that objections to this claim don't work? Well, let's learn what the objections might be. So one objection to this statement is the following, and he calls this Objection 1. So the first objection says that any ordinary person can easily talk about their sensations, but cannot say anything really and does not know what is happening with their brain. And so one might argue that right there, that shows that they can't be the same thing. Because if they were the same thing, then we should be able to just switch back and forth between talking about our sensations and talking about our brain states. But we have no knowledge of the brain states, only the sensations. Okay, so Objection 1. An ordinary person, like you don't need to be a scientist or a specialist, an ordinary person can easily talk about their sensations, but cannot say and does not know what is happening in their brain. And so therefore one might conclude, so the two things must not be the same. Okay. So an ordinary person can easily talk about their sensations, but cannot say what is happening in their brain, and so the two things must not be the same, the sensations and the brain processes. So goes the objection. Let me try to explain this objection in a little more depth. What it says is this. Consider how when you talk about your experiences, you have no trouble doing that. That's like 90% of conversation, because people are always talking about themselves. So it's like you say what you thought the experience was like. If I ask you to tell me about a movie that you watched, no problem. You're going to be like, oh, it was funny, or it was boring, or it kind of got exciting in the last third, or there's a major plot twist and it had me on the edge of my seat. You can talk to me about experiences. You could say, I was taking a test and I was forgetting the information and I started to kind of like blank out, so I just had to leave some answers blank and I was really anxious when I submitted it. That's talking about sensations in the everyday language of just how it was to experience it from the first person point of view. But notice that you can't convert that same statement into brain talk. If I ask you how the meal was, you might say, oh, it was delicious, but it was a little salty. But you can't say, or if you prefer, let me tell you technically, the meal, when I started eating it, left frontal cortex, there's a whole bunch of neural activity in this particular lobe, and then the synapses firing over here in the prefrontal cortex cause these dopamine receptors to discharge, and that was actually how the meal was. So you understand, like, if sensations are brain processes, then in a way these two things ought to be identical with each other. Your feeling of the meal and then whatever physical state of the brain that your brain was in at that time. But because average people cannot say anything about what's happening in the brain, I mean, even if you're a neuroscientist, there's a lot of the workings of the brain that are not yet fully understood. So we cannot switch back and forth between sensation and brain talk. And that might make some people, like the critic here, think that they cannot be the same thing. How could a sensation be a brain process if I can talk to you all day about my sensations informally, but I cannot say the first thing at all about what the brain was at that point in time? Makes it seem like they're not the same thing. But he has a good reply to this. Okay, so keep in mind it is J.J.C. Smart who's going to try and defeat the objections, overcome the objections. So here's his response to this, okay? The reply from the author. He basically says this, that just because there are two words or labels for something in language, that does not mean that there have to be two different things. It does not mean that they must refer to two different things. Okay, so just because there are two different words or labels for something in language, just because there are two different words or labels for something in language does not mean that they have to refer to two different things. In other words, even when there are two different words or labels, they can refer to the same thing. And it does not mean that they have to refer to two different things. And there's an example that he gives to make this clear. And so I'm going to put that here. Example given, e.g., the morning and the evening star. The morning star and the evening star. Okay, so now I'm going to fully explain this last point here. Now, the reply says, once again, that just because there are two different words or labels for something in language, like, for example, the terminology of sensation and terminology of brain process, just because there are these two different linguistic descriptions or labels, that does not mean that the two different labels have to refer to two different things. In fact, they can refer to the same thing. And an example of such a point is the morning and the evening star. So let me tell you a little true story. This was discussed in a paper by a great German philosopher of the late 19th and early 20th century named Gottlob Frege. I'm a big fan of his work. That was actually the first published work that I did, was something about Frege. But anyway, he uses this example, which is true. So at one point, go back in time a couple hundred years when there wasn't, like, electrical lighting and stuff. So there's a lot less light pollution. And even in big cities, you could see the full canopy of stars at night, and even in the morning at dawn. So people that would get out at night and look at the sky and see the stars, they would notice the brightest star in the evening sky. And so a word was given for that particular object, and they called it the evening star. Okay, so are we all clear? The evening star is what? It's the brightest star that you can see in the evening sky. Now, in the same time period, when you would wake up in the morning and it was early dawn, again, because there was no competing sources of light, you could still see quite a few stars in the morning sky as well. And they had the brightest star in the morning sky that they labeled the morning star. Okay, so far, basically simple, long story short, the brightest star in the evening, they called it evening star. The brightest star in the morning, they called it morning star. Eventually a discovery was made, though, guys. And if you're following this lesson and you're quick on your feet, you might be able to guess even. What do you think was this discovery pertaining to the so-called morning and evening star?
Same star.
It's the same star, yes. That was discovered. In fact, it wasn't even a star. It was the planet Venus, which appears as though a star from the surface of the Earth under certain lighting conditions. But anyway, right, correct. they did discover that these are not two different stars, but one and the same object referred to twice over with two different labels. So can we all agree that just because we had the two words, that didn't make it be two stars, right? It's one star, but just two labels attached to the same object. In the same way, I could say I'm Professor Vulich, or I'm the musician Richard Vulich, and those sound like different descriptions, but I am one person, even though there could be a multitude of different labels or terms used to refer to me. So language should not by itself mislead us into thinking that the establishment of multiplicity of reference terms for something must mean that there's more than one thing. And so going back to the original objection, someone says, I can tell you all day about how I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing, what my sensations are, but I haven't got the foggiest idea about anything happening with the brain. So don't tell me sensations are brain processes, because it's just a different role in language for talking about the two things. Now here is Smart coming back and saying, no, just because there are two different linguistic descriptions or words, it's definitely possible, and in many clear cases that we could point out, it's actually the case that multiple terms do in fact refer to one and the same object. So if I met someone at like an event, introduce myself as this professor, have a nice conversation, come back a couple hours later with like a full-on costume and Hollywood outfit, like makeup, and introduce myself as a different person, they may leave the party thinking like, wow, I met two really interesting and different people that seem to not like each other, whatever. I could make this plot as weird as I want. And, they would think they dealt with two people, but it was one person with different appearances referred to by two different labels or words. So sensations and brain processes are kind of like that. Two words for the same thing, but one thing nonetheless. And maybe it is a different way of describing the one thing, talking about it from the subjective point of view of the subject who has the sensations versus talking about it from the third person point of view of a person who would like observe a brain scan of your brain. But they are one and the same thing, and the first and third person distinction kind of just breaks down, and that's what he says. So let me read about it, and you can hear his own way of putting this point. Now, his statement of the objection, I don't know the language he uses, it's almost, I don't know why, but it's almost funny to me. He says, any illiterate peasant can perfectly well talk about his after images or how things look or feel to him or about his aches and pains, and yet he may know nothing whatsoever about neurophysiology. A man may even believe that the brain is an organ for cooling the body down without any impairment of his ability to talk about his sensations. So that means that the things we're talking about when we describe sensations can't be processes of the brain. But now he comes back with his response, and he says below, oh, you might as well say that a nation of lazy people who never saw the morning star or knew it existed, or who had never thought of the expression morning star, but who did use the expression evening star, could not use the expression to refer to the same object. And so, yeah, like Frege talks about that. It's kind of a humorous part in his essay, the original on sense and reference, on Sinn und Bedeutung in German. He says, imagine you got two friends, unlikely friendship, where one is like a super night owl, never gets up early. The other person is the early bird, and never stays up late. And the night owl is like, hey, morning man, why don't you stay up with me one of these nights? Because I think you're missing out on this evening star. It's beautiful. You ever heard of it? He's like, yeah, I've heard of it, but I just can't stay up that late. But what about you? Get up with me one of these mornings, evening man, because you're missing out on the morning star. Don't you think you want to see that? And he says, you could just tell me about it. That's fine. I'll stick with the evening star. And these two people look like they're having a conversation about two separate objects, but yet it's one, even though the labels are different. Another example he gives to make the same point, if you prefer a second analogy, he gives the case of lightning and electricity. Okay, so lightning, what is it? It is just an electrical discharge of water vapor in the Earth's atmosphere. So it's an electrical discharge of ions. So lightning is electricity. It's not like there's the lightning and then separate from that the electricity and they're somehow connected to each other. But it's the same thing, just referred to by two different labels. He says, modern physical science tells us that lightning is a certain kind of electrical discharge due to the ionization of clouds of water vapor in the atmosphere. This is the true nature physically of what lightning is. Note that there are not two things, a flash of lightning and an electrical discharge. There is one thing, a flash of lightning, which is scientifically described as an electrical discharge. It's not like having a footprint and a burglar. The footprint is evidence that the burglar was there, but the burglar is not literally identical to the footprint. So when you think of the identity assertion that sensations are brain processes, we're not just saying these two things are correlated. They are the same thing, just one and the same thing by two different names. Okay, so now, if you think you understood this first little exchange between his critic and him, then that's really important to me because that's the core of this whole essay. As much as there are other objections in his paper, they really follow closely from the reasoning offered here. So like this would be the core main theme for you to kind of be able to recognize and understand from this paper. So I just want to pause for it on one longer second. Going back to his beginning statement, he says sensations are brain processes. If they weren't, that would be weird because then they would be gnomological danglers. And scientists don't believe there should be such gnomological danglers. Ultimately, everything should be explicable according to physical laws and science. So consciousness and sensations are just brain processes. That means they're physical things because the brain is physical. Now someone says, hey, they're not the same. They're not the same. Why? Well, they're not the same because I can talk about my sensations, but I don't know anything about what's happening in my brain. So how could those two things really be the same? A basic sensation of even just like being bored or happy or something versus a brain state. I can talk about my boredom or happiness, easy, can't tell you what's happening in my brain, so there you go, they're not the same. And his response to that is, well, hold on. Just because you do have two different words or labels for one and the same thing, this does not necessarily always imply that they're two different things. Consider the morning and the evening star. Consider lightning and electricity. If you really believe those were two different things, you'd be letting language mislead you into thinking there's more things than one. Okay, so like I can describe an object in any number of different ways. Your mom, you could say, is your mom or your dad's wife or something, but using multiple different labels does not multiply the person or the object into more than one being. And so that's his response, and that's the point. But let's try and talk about a few more of the objections and replies too while we're here. A second objection, which is very similar in form and meaning to the first, is this. Okay, so objection 2, following along the same lines, the words brain process and sensation have different meanings linguistically, so they must not be the same thing. Have different meanings. So they must not be the same thing. Another possible objection. Okay, so these words have different meanings, and that must be the reason that they're not the same. Reply is very similar to the previous response. It's just all this establishes is that the words have different meaning. But again, as we've seen with lightning and electricity or etc., just because two words have different meanings, they can still refer to the same object. Okay, so reply. Two words can have different meanings and still denote the same thing. Okay, so these are just another case where language is a little different, but the things that are referred to by language are the same. And it's true that they don't have the same linguistic meaning. When you talk about a sensation, you're talking about it from the first person perspective, how it was like for you. When you talk about a brain process, you just talk about the objective state of the brain at that time, whether or not you were the one that had the experience or not. So converting the first personal subjective description of the sensation into the third personal physical description of the brain, it takes a little bit of work, but it's not that it's two different things. Why then do we not talk about the brain process when we speak about our sensations? Because it would not suit the purposes of any ordinary conversation. The only time you'd really have to talk about the states of the brain is if you were doing like a neuroscience experiment in a lab or something, and you're like, okay, we're going to now look at what happens to his prefrontal cortex when we stimulate it with this particular type of, I don't know, chemical. in everyday life, we don't have to do that. So if someone asks you how the film was and you started saying, well, let me tell you exactly, in the left cortex, I had a lot of neurological activity, but it was kind of balanced out by other dopamine receptor sites firing in the back base of the frontal lobe. If you started saying this, no one would understand you and they would probably think you're losing your mind. So it would not suit the purposes of ordinary conversation to translate from sensation talk into brain process talk. But just because it doesn't have any practical purpose doesn't mean that it's literally false. So even though you don't think about your brain and what it's going through when you talk about your sensations, he's just mentioning that that's simply a linguistic thing. In physical terms, it is a sensation of the sensation is a brain process. And the only reason that we're not in the habit of talking about it as such is, first of all, it's not perfectly well understood scientifically. But secondly, because it would not suit the ordinary needs of conversation where people are not interested in the precise details of your brain state, but rather just how it felt, what it was like, and how it appeared to you, whatever the experience was. Okay, so a pair of objections and a few responses that he gives. Let me zoom around a little because I said I don't want to talk about all 8 of them, but another one we can go into is number 4, objection 4. This is a little interesting, kind of a clever objection, but I think he does a decent job pushing back. The objection says that sensations don't have any spatial or physical location, but a brain process clearly does, and so that might make you think they're not the same. So let me write it here.
What happened to 3?
I skipped 3 because I'm saying that I'm just going to kind of sample from the ones that I thought were the most essential. I wouldn't have time for all 8, and so I just make some editorial decisions. Some of them were a little easier to present and less important overall than others. So objection 4, but thank you for that. So objection 4 just says this. My sensations are not, let me write it that way, sensations have no physical or spatial location. But the brain process does, so they must not be the same thing. Okay, so this is about where the thing is. Sensations, the claims objection says, have no physical or spatial location. They're located nowhere in space. But the brain process does, of course, have a spatial and physical location, so that's why this says they're not the same thing. Let me try and illustrate with some quick examples. So I will ask you to right now create a sensation, a state of consciousness. Can you think of your mother's face for a moment? Okay. Now, you're thinking of her face, maybe, some of you are at home, you can even see her if you're still there with her, but either way, imagine in your mind's eye the face of your mom. I don't know, maybe this is not the right example, because if you do live with your mom, then you could easily just look at it too without having to imagine it. So I'm going to give you a different example, even though that one does work for me. I don't want to confuse you. Think back to what you were doing on New Year's, okay? Go back in your mind, in your memories, and try and remember that. Now I'm going to ask you this. Where is that memory located physically? Where is it in space? Is it floating around out in front of you? No, projected like a hologram. You start thinking and then something is appearing in front of you that I can see as well? No. So it's not like your memories are out there in the environment. What about inside of you? Even that's kind of not really going to work. If I was to, I would never do this, but suppose that somebody would dissect your brain and stuff. They're not going to see the memory that you're having there either. What they're going to see is a bunch of brain tissue and blood and different, body parts. So the memory, it looks like it's just nowhere. You're having it, but it's not in the space physically around you, nor are we going to find it if we were to look within. So it's nowhere in space, but where's the brain process located? Well, that's very easy. Where else could it be? The brain process is where the brain is, because that's where the physical location of the brain is, in the skull. So these might be another way of trying to tear the two things apart: sensations, conscious states, versus brain processes. Because an argument can be made like this, that the sensations don't have a physical location, but a brain process does, so they're not the same type of thing. The author gives an interesting example of some sensation that has no physical location. He gives the case of an after image. Very briefly, if you have a light source around you, like in this classroom, there's several fluorescent light bars. That's kind of why you see this glare on the screen. If you look up at that light source very briefly, or in your own apartment or room, wherever you're at, if there's a light bulb on or something, if you not too long, I don't want you to hurt your eyes, but if you quickly look at it and then close your eyes, do you notice that there remains an outline of the light source burned into the closed field of vision? And so in this case, it creates like a purplish tint in the shape of the fluorescent light bars. And that stays in my field of vision just while the eyes are closed for a little while. This is an after image, guys, okay? It's a familiar phenomenon of vision, if you can understand what I'm saying. So he uses that as his example of a sensation which is located nowhere. Do that thing with the light and then ask yourself, where's the after image? It's certainly not floating around the room. And it's also not going to be found or uncovered in a physical examination of the contents of your body. But brain processes have a physical location. So what about that? The reply from Mr. Smart is pretty straightforward again. And he just says, look, the sensation is a brain process. And so despite appearances, it does have a physical location where the brain is. Just we don't usually think about that. Okay, so the sensation is a brain process. And so the sensation does have a physical location. Now, why is it that we don't point out the location of our thoughts, feelings, and mental states? Because again, outside of philosophy or neuroscience, it would be quite awkward, wouldn't it? If you told somebody, you know, I had a great time at this weekend. I actually, you know, since I'm vaccinated, I was able to meet up with some friends, and we actually did like a little backyard party. It was awesome. And you're telling them about your experience, and like, okay, so you remember all that, right? You're like, yeah. And then you say, can you tell me where the experience was? First of all, that question would be strange. You'd probably refer back to like where it happened. But like, no, I mean your memory that you're having right now. Where is that at? Be a very strange question, but it wouldn't literally be false to say, you want to know, the memory's here in my brain. It's in my brain where I'm standing. It would also be strange if you offer that up. If you're like, yeah, I had a great experience this week and I'm having a memory of it right now, and the memory's located in my skull. The person would probably be like, well, I didn't ask you that, and that's not necessary to report. But again, just because we're not in the habit of pointing out these kind of facts or whatever, that does not necessarily make them false. So even if it doesn't suit the purposes of casual conversation to refer to the position of your experiences and sensations, it's not literally false to say they're in the head. So that's why he thinks this is not a serious fatal objection to his view either, that sensations are brain processes. Now there's just two more quick objections at the end that I kind of wanted us to dismiss and deal with. Maybe I can at least get through one more. We'll see. That's objection 6. Like I say, I'm jumping around a bit just to give you what I thought were the greatest hits or whatever from his paper. What's another objection against his view? That sensations are brain processes. Number 6. 6 says that sensations are private, but brain processes can be publicly observed, and therefore they cannot be the same thing. Cordy, hippocampus is a fun word to use, though. Maybe we should talk about our memories in terms of brain process more. Yeah, that'd be funny, right? It'd be like, oh yeah, the hippocampus, you know, is having this type of physical phenomenon in the brain. That wouldn't really bother me too much, but of course, you know, you're going to get a lot of weird looks, I guess, in an open society. But yeah, objection 6. Sensations are private. They can't be shared. So sensations can't be publicly observed. That's another way to say they're private to the one that had them. But brain processes can be, so they must not be the same thing. Okay, sensations cannot be publicly observed, but brain processes can, so they must not be the same. If I ask you to think of the memory of your last birthday, and you know, you report to me how it was or what you did, the report is based on your memory, but your memory is not given to me when you relay it to me. It's not like I start having your memories. I just hear you speaking to me about them, and I take in the information secondhand. Right now, if I'm asking you to think of a mental image of your mom's face, I can't see the face, but you can because it's in your mind's eye. And so understand that the sensations that you have, whether it's a mental image or whether it's pleasure, pain, thoughts, whatever little secret thoughts you're having right now, that's just for you. I can't know, even if they're making fun of me or something. So I'm sure you're not, but I'm just being funny. So the thought is that you can't relay your sensations unless you choose to report them. But even when you do, it's not the same thing as the other person having the same sensation. They just gain information about what you went through. Even if you go to a movie with another person, you're watching the same movie, your experiences of it are individual to the two people. So sensations are locked away in the cognitive domain of your own psychology, and unless and until you report them to others, we don't even learn about them. So sensations cannot be made available for public observation. If I ask you, tell me about your mother, you can't just say, well, look, I'll just give you a memory of her so you can just deal with it on your own and I won't have to say anything. So your sensations are just for yourself. They can't be shared to others. I mean, they can be shared in the sense of reporting on them, but it's not the same thing as giving that person the same memory, the same experience. On the other hand, though, brain processes, at least, within the limits of our technology, they can be observed publicly. You can look at a brain scan. You can, have a neuroscientist examine cognitive activity of the working brain. So if we can look at a brain scan and see brain processes, but we cannot see the experience that is supposed to be identical to the brain process, wouldn't you think maybe that means that they're not the same? Once again, though, his reply is kind of well-worn by now. The familiar reply, again, is that this is just a linguistic difference and not a real physical difference. So this is, again, a difference in the language we use when we talk about sensations or brain states, not a physical difference. So when you report a mental state that's a sensation, you are just reporting on a physical state of the brain. And once again, he kind of returns to his common theme of the paper in making these replies, that we should not be misled by the way that language can create distinct descriptions of one thing into believing that it's one and the same thing. So when we talk about sensations / brain processes from the subjective first person point of view, the first person point of view of the subject that experiences that sensation, we talk about it in a private way. My experience, my memory, my hopes, fears, dreams, pleasures, and pains. When we talk about the brain state, we switch into third personal language about the brain and its particular physical configuration. Even though this makes it appear as though there's two distinct objects or existences, this is just another linguistic difference, but it does not report on a physical difference between two objects. And so there was only one last objection. I'll be able to report on that quickly at the beginning on Wednesday, and then we're pretty much caught up in the notes. So try to read Alan Turing's article on computing machinery and intelligence for Wednesday, and then that'll be our last piece of philosophy of mind. And then on Friday, we'll start on the last topic of the semester, which is life and death. So anyway then, guys, I'll let you go. But let me see if everyone's good to go. And once you are ready to sign off and say goodbye, then I'll close our stream for today. Don't forget your second papers are due next Friday, not this week, but Friday next week. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Cordy, Zoe, and everybody else. I appreciate you guys, and thanks for your attendance today. Try and stay strong to the end. And I'm sure you'll do well in your classes if you do that. Okay, guys, have a good one. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much. See you, Lane.